tremor was a minor thing, a deep shudder that ran through the bones of the old city. In New Orleans, on October 14th, 1978, the ground didn't shake so much as it sighed, a tired exhale from centuries of bearing the weight of brick and wrought iron. At 4:30 inches the morning, firefighter Rusty Arsenault stood knee-deep in rubble, the air thick with the dust of plaster and the ghost of old horsehair insulation. He'd been called out to a partial collapse in a forgotten alley of the French Quarter, a routine job after a nearby gas line had ruptured with a low boom. But now, he was frozen. His flashlight beam cut a clean white circle through the darkness, and in that circle was something that didn't belong. The back wall of an ancient carriageway, built when this city was still Spanish, had crumbled away, revealing what it had hidden for decades. A well, not a wishing well, but an old cistern, deep and dark, its stone opening jagged and hungry. It had been sealed with heavy slate slabs, then covered over with rotten pallets and stacks of yellowed newspapers. The blast had shifted the slabs. Rusty aimed his light into the blackness. He didn't scream. The breath simply left his body. Down there, tangled in the shadows, were bones. A chaotic pile of them. Human bones. For a long moment, he just stood there, the only sound his own heartbeat in his ears, trying to comprehend how many there were and how long they had been waiting in the dark. 20 minutes later, the flashing blue and red lights of a police cruiser would paint the narrow alley in frantic, silent strokes. An hour after that, a grim-faced homicide detective would arrive, and 24 hours later, a coded teletype message, stamped top secret, would be sent from the New Orleans field office to FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. 3 days after that, a man named Elias Vance would step off a plane at Moisson Field. He was a special agent from the Bureau, 34 years old, a man who had never set foot in Louisiana, a man who had never seen a case quite like this. He didn't know it yet, but that dark well was the gateway to a story of murder that had unspooled over 7 long years. He didn't know the killers lived less than 100 yards away, that they were known and even liked by the whole neighborhood. He didn't know that everyone in that neighborhood was afraid of them and that they were protected by a man with a corner office at City Hall and the entire political machine of New Orleans at his back. To understand how such a thing was possible, you have to go back to 1971, back to a quiet cellar tucked beneath the ancient stones of the quarter, a place that smelled of sweet Muscadine wine and hot butter, a place where there was always a warm welcome and a seat at the table for a lonely man far from home. In 1971, New Orleans was a city of two minds. The first was the American city, the one of progress and commerce. It lived along the wide avenues of Canal Street and Poydras, in the shadow of new glass and steel towers. It rode in long, sleek Cadillacs and rumbling streetcars, shopped in modern department stores, and smelled of gasoline and the brackish air rolling off the Mississippi. This was a city being built with oil money, a place of ambition and concrete. But the second city was older, deeper. It was the French Quarter, the Vieux Carré, a city within a city, hiding behind its centuries-old walls of brick and stucco. Here, the lanes were so narrow 2 people could barely pass without turning sideways. The townhouses leaned against each other for support, their seams blurred by time, their wrought iron balconies dripping with ferns. The air smelled of damp stone, chicory coffee, and sweet olive blossoms. Laundry fluttered on lines strung between shuttered windows, while cats slept soundly on sun-warmed sills. The laws of the state of Louisiana had entered this place, but they had never fully taken hold. The local beat cop, a man named Tyrell Martin, walked these streets every day, and every day he felt the walls were watching him, not the other way around. Every cobblestone had a story, and here, secrets were not given up to outsiders. The quarter lived by its own code, a set of rules that were quiet, unwritten, but absolute. Councilman Richard Sterling understood this better than anyone. He was 57, a tall man with a neatly trimmed mustache who always smelled of expensive cologne. He held the powerful seat of District C, and his office at City Hall overlooked Lafayette Square. A black city-owned Lincoln Continental waited for him downstairs, always polished, always ready. A loyal member of the city's political machine since the early 50s. But Councilman Sterling, as they called him downtown, was known simply as Richard here. He had grown up in these alleys. This was his turf. And when his younger brother died, leaving behind 2 orphan nieces, he considered them his own. He helped them, looked out for them, and when necessary, he protected them. The nieces were named Martha and Sarah Miller. Their father, Matthew, had died of a fever in 1965. He was a quiet, hard-working man, a cooper who knew the old ways of making barrels for wine and whiskey. Their mother had died, giving birth to Sarah, the younger one. The girls grew up with just their father, and he taught them everything he knew, not about barrel making, but about the other family tradition, tending the small patch of Muscadine grapes they had in a garden behind the house. He taught them how to crush the grapes, how to ferment the wine in old ceramic crocks, how to age it until it was dark and rich, with the subtle taste of southern herbs. That wine was his pride, and it was the only inheritance he left his daughters. By 1971, Martha Miller was 42. She was tall and broad-shouldered, with strong hands and a slow, deliberate way of moving. She was a woman of few words. A jagged, faded scar ran from her left cheek down to her neck. The neighbors knew the story of that scar. Her husband, a drunk and a bully, had come at her with a fishing knife one night. He never got the chance to use it. Martha had been faster. What she'd used, nobody in the quarter said out loud. They only knew that her husband was gone the next day. His disappearance was officially ruled a probable drowning in the Mississippi, a tragic accident. The case was closed without much of an investigation. Councilman Sterling had made a few calls. After that, Martha changed. She wasn't mean, just closed off like a heavy door bolted from the inside. Sarah was different. At 36, she was shorter than her sister, with warm, olive skin and honey-colored eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. Her voice was low and soft, with a gentle Louisiana drawl that made men lean in closer to listen. Men turned to look at her on the street. Men stopped what they were doing to watch her pass. Men forgot where they were going. Sarah knew how to talk. She knew just how to ask about a man's family, his job, his hometown, in a way that made him feel like he was the only person in the world. 10 minutes with her, and a man would be telling her things he'd never told his own wife. She never pushed, never pried. She just listened, poured another glass of the dark, sweet wine, and offered that warm, understanding smile. In 1968, the sisters opened a small, unlicensed eatery in their cellar. It wasn't a restaurant, not really. It was just a place, a secret you had to be told about. You went down a set of steep stone steps into a cool, subterranean room. There were a few wooden tables, lit by the soft glow of hurricane lamps. The air smelled of fried onions, crawfish étouffée, and hot French bread. And of course, there was the homemade Muscadine wine, served in simple ceramic pitchers. The cellar was tucked away in a hidden courtyard, just a stone's throw from Jackson Square. It was a quiet, almost invisible spot. Not even most locals knew it was there, and those who did kept it to themselves. This place didn't need advertising. Its customers were brought to it. Gene Walker was sitting in the lobby of the Pontchartrain Hotel when a shipyard worker he'd been talking to leaned in close. "You want to get some real dinner?" the man whispered. "Not this hotel food. I know a place." For folks in the know, Gene Walker had arrived from Detroit 3 days earlier. He was a mechanical engineer, a specialist in pumping systems, on a 1-month contract with a local shipping company. He was 40, with reddish hair and friendly, crinkling eyes. He had a wife and 2 kids, a boy in 8th grade and a girl in 5th. He'd promised to bring them back alligator trinkets and a box of pralines. He went. Of course, he went. The hotel restaurant served bland club sandwiches and watery iced tea. This man was promising real New Orleans cooking, jambalaya, and homemade wine. It was October of 1971. Gene Walker walked down a set of stone steps into a cellar, and he never came back up. He entered the cellar around 8 in the evening. It was warm and dim inside. 3 tables were covered with simple checkered cloths. 2 longshoremen sat at one, speaking in low murmurs. The place smelled of rich seafood stew and something herbal like thyme. A faded tapestry hung on the stone wall. Sarah Miller emerged from behind a curtain, and her face broke into an immediate, welcoming smile. It was a genuine smile, the kind you give to an old friend. "Evening. Sugar. Come on in. Sit right here. It's cozier by the wall." Walker sat, taking it all in. The 2 workers at the other table finished their drinks and soon stood to leave. Within a few minutes, they were gone. He was alone. Sarah placed a steaming bowl of gumbo in front of him, the dark roux, thick with shrimp and sausage. She set down a basket of hot, crusty bread and brought a pitcher of wine. "This is our own," she said softly. "My daddy's recipe. You try." The wine was dark and heavy, and it smelled of grapes and something else. Something he couldn't quite place. He wouldn't have been able to identify it even if he'd tried. But he wasn't trying. He was eating, drinking, and talking to Sarah, who asked him all about Detroit, about the auto plants, about his children, and she looked at him with an expression of such deep interest. It felt like the most fascinating story she had ever heard. After the second glass, Walker felt a pleasant heaviness in his arms. After the third, he felt nothing at all. He fell asleep right there at the table, his head resting on his folded arms, his breathing deep and even. Sarah cleared the pitcher from the table, walked to the curtain, and called her sister's name in a low voice. What happened next? The investigation would piece together 7 years later from circumstantial evidence and Martha's chillingly simple confession. The act itself was brutally efficient. The medical examiner would determine that death came quickly, while the victim was unconscious. Martha knew what she was doing. Her hands were strong. Before dawn, the body was lowered into the old well in the courtyard. His belongings, the company ID, the cash in his wallet, his Timex watch, the key to his hotel room were burned in the furnace beneath the cellar. The next morning, Sarah was waiting outside the Pontchartrain Hotel. She approached the front desk clerk. "Excuse me," she said, her voice full of neighborly concern. "I saw one of your guests last night, a red-headed fella. He was pretty drunk, getting into a car with some folks. I just hope he's all right. You know how it is. A man on a business trip gets to drinking." The clerk sighed. He knew exactly how it was. He made a note in the guest ledger. * Walker. G. Checked out early. Whereabouts unknown. *. A letter went out to his company in Detroit. *. Employee failed to return from assignment. Last known location unconfirmed. *. His wife raised hell, calling the company, calling the New Orleans police. They conducted a perfunctory, formal inquiry. The conclusion: a possible accident. Or maybe he just ran off. It happens. No one looked for him in earnest. Gene Walker was officially listed as a missing person. His name was entered into a file, and then forgotten. For a long, long time, his 2 children in Detroit waited for their father to come home with pralines and stories about the bayou. After that first murder, Martha didn't sleep for 3 nights. She just sat in the dark by the wall, smoking one cigarette after another. Sarah would later tell the detective that her sister cried only once, that first night. Then she stopped. The money they found on Gene Walker wasn't much, $42 and some change. But for the sisters, it was more than they made in a month of running the supper club, more than they earned in 30 days of hard, honest work. And that was the motive. Not hatred, not madness. Money. Simple, crisp American dollars. The per diem allowances, the travel advances, the cash that men on business trips from up north carried in their wallets. The motive was so mundane it was terrifying. New Orleans in the early 70s moved to a special rhythm. The oil boom meant money, and money meant motion. Every month, new specialists flew in from Houston, from Chicago, from New York. The big hotels on Canal Street were always full. The shipyards and offshore rigs were constantly building, constantly hiring. The work never stopped, and the men who came for that work lived in hotels and shared a common feeling. A little lost, a little out of place in a city where the accent was different, the smells were different, the food was different. They longed for something simple, a decent home-cooked meal, a glass of real wine, someone to talk to about something other than work. And that is precisely what the Miller Sisters Supper Club offered. That is precisely what made it such a perfect trap. Sarah had a gift for spotting these men. She later told Detective Vance, "I'd look at their eyes. If a man has a lost look, a kind of boyish look, it means he's lonely. It means he's grateful when someone talks to him. Those men, they're in no hurry to leave. Those men were in no hurry to leave, and it cost them their lives." The supper club was only open 3 or 4 nights a week, never on a set schedule. Sarah explained it as a way to keep things special, so guests came not out of habit, but for a rare treat. Martha did the cooking. Gumbo thick with okra and seafood, crawfish étouffée, creamy and spiced just right. Jambalaya, rich with sausage and shrimp. Everything was homemade, hearty, and hot. Sarah served the tables. She would sit down with the ones she had chosen, talk with them, and keep their glasses full. When the guests fell asleep, it always happened quickly. Within half an hour of the third glass, Sarah would remove the pitcher of poisoned wine and take it back to the kitchen. Any other guests, if there were any, would just see a man who'd had a little too much to drink and dozed off. It happens. Let him rest. Later, after everyone else had gone home, Sarah would call for Martha. It was a clean system, no wasted motion, no fuss. The neighbors sometimes saw a light burning in the cellar late at night, but they never asked questions. The sisters had told them once, "We're lining the furnace, have to work at night when it's cool." The explanation was enough. October in New Orleans is warm and quiet. The leaves on the sweet gum trees turn a slow, lazy yellow. The air loses its humid bite, but the nights are still mild. The evenings are long. It's a good time to sit in a cool cellar under a flickering lamp and drink dark wine. That October, in 1971, was the last peaceful month for 7 men. We need to talk about Stephen Thompson. He was the only one who might have stopped it all years earlier. He was 32, a journalist for a major national magazine, with 5 years of experience under his belt. He wrote about industry, about oil booms, about the great American machine at work. He was a calm, meticulous man with a professional habit of noticing things that didn't add up. When he first felt the effects of the poisoned wine, the drowsiness, the heaviness in his head, the sensation that the floor was tilting beneath his feet, his instinct was different from the others. It wasn't, asterisk, I've had too much to drink, I need some air, asterisk. It was asterisk, there's something wrong with this wine, remember this, asterisk. And he did. He made a note of it. He came back a second time, but now his eyes were sharp, analytical. He noticed the details. There were 2 different pitchers. Some guests were served from one, others from another. Sarah did it smoothly, but not invisibly. Thompson was smart, but he wasn't careful enough. He came back a third time, unannounced, acting casual. Sarah saw him on the steps and smiled, that warm, welcoming smile. She knew he wasn't just coming back for the food, and she knew what she had to do. This time, the dose in his pitcher was different. It was much larger. Sarah had calculated it perfectly. Thompson never even made it to the door. His notebook, the first one with the suspicious scribbles, was left behind in his hotel room. His editor found it 2 weeks after he disappeared. While clearing out his desk, he read the notes. He didn't understand them at first. Then, A cold dread crept over him. Quietly, without fanfare, he sent an official inquiry to the New Orleans Police Department. The inquiry moved through the bureaucracy slowly, the way all things move through bureaucracy, but it moved, and in the end, that would make all the difference. Because the disappearance of a journalist from a national magazine was not the same as the disappearance of an engineer from Detroit. It raised questions on a completely different level. Stephen Thompson couldn't stop the sisters himself, but he became the final, fatal drop in a cup that was already overflowing. After him, the machine that Councilman Richard Sterling had kept stalled for 7 years began to grind forward. Slowly at first, but unstoppably. A few words about the kind of man Elias Vance was. He arrived in New Orleans a total stranger. He didn't know the rhythm of the city, didn't understand the local politics, didn't know who he could trust. In a place where everyone seemed to be connected to everyone else by invisible threads of family, business, and favors owed, it would have been easy to make a mistake, to trust the wrong person, to show his hand too soon. Vance didn't make a mistake because he had a simple habit. He never rushed. He watched, he listened, and he wrote everything down. And he had another habit. He was not afraid of silence. When the old woman, Mrs. Dubois, wouldn't open her door, he sat on her porch steps and waited. When Councilman Sterling spoke in vague, charming circles, Vance just stayed quiet and let him talk. When the local police captain dragged his feet, he noted it in his pocketbook and found another way around. He wasn't a hero, he was a professional. There's a difference. After the New Orleans case, he went back to Washington and received a commendation. A few months later, he was sent to another case out west. It was also complex, also with a political angle. He never talked about New Orleans, maybe because there was nothing to say that wasn't in the official report, that wasn't his way, or maybe because some cases leave no words behind. They just leave a notebook filled with neat, meticulous entries and a single word written on the final page. Closed. A year passed after the first murder, then another. The supper club kept operating. The gumbo, the étouffée, the hot bread. Sarah smiled. Martha worked silently over the stove. The wine flowed into the simple ceramic glasses. The neighbors grew accustomed to the quiet cellar in the hidden courtyard. They grew accustomed to the fact that strangers sometimes went down those steps and were never seen again. Tourists, the neighbors would say to each other. Businessmen, they come, they eat, they leave. What's to think about? Mrs. Dubois, a neighbor of 80 years, a tiny, dry woman with sharp eyes beneath a dark headscarf, thought otherwise. She had lived in the house across the courtyard her entire life. She'd watched Martha and Sarah grow up. She'd seen the supper club open, and she had seen the quiet movements in the courtyard late at night. She'd heard a dull, heavy thud, like a sack of grain being dropped. Once, she asked Martha directly about the noise. Martha looked at her for a long time, her gaze heavy. Then she said, "We're moving crates of wine, Mrs. Dubois. It's cooler to do it at night." Mrs. Dubois never asked again, and she never told anyone what she saw. She had lived in the quarter for 80 years. She knew there were things it was better to be silent about. On the next street over, a man named Antoine Rousseau sold antiques. He was 40, an easygoing, talkative man. He sometimes heard strange sounds from over the wall at night. He figured it was just the stray cats. The quarter was always full of cats. And so the time passed. Paulie Simmons came to the supper club in March of 1973. He was a sailor off a tanker docked in the port, a kid from Galveston, Texas, 28 years old, strong. His face tanned from the salt and wind. He didn't come alone. He had 2 shipmates with him. But his friends had a glass of wine and left. They had other plans. Paulie stayed. Sarah was already sitting beside him, telling him stories about the city, about the river, about how Mississippi catfish was unlike any other fish in the world. Paulie laughed, he drank, and he told her about the Gulf Coast, and about how his mother wrote him a letter every single week, praying he'd find himself a good girl to marry. Maybe a New Orleans girl, Sarah had said, with that warm smile. Paulie poured himself a third glass. An hour and a half later, he was gone. His mother in Galveston kept writing letters to his ship for another 6 months. Then she wrote to the shipping company headquarters. They replied, *subject disembarked in New Orleans and failed to return to the vessel. Considered a deserter. The case was handed over to the military police. Their investigation turned up nothing. Paulie Simmons was listed as having abandoned his post. His mother never believed it. But what could she do? All the way from Galveston, Arthur Lewis appeared in 1975. He was a purchasing agent from Chicago, 51 years old. Balding, in a jacket with worn elbows, he carried a battered brown leather briefcase everywhere he went. He was in town to negotiate a supply contract for canned goods. His factory up north needed Louisiana tomatoes and cane vinegar. He was an experienced, street-smart man, used to life on the road. He liked a good meal and appreciated good wine. A young man he'd met at the French market brought him to the supper club. A local kid, Sarah, sometimes paid $1 or $2 for bringing in out-of-town guests. The kid thought she was just trying to build her business. Maybe he thought that for the rest of his life. Lewis came with cash, a travel advance plus a significant amount of petty cash. He carried sums with him for business expenses not run through the banks, the old-fashioned way. The investigation would later estimate he had nearly $4,000 on him. $4,000 was more than Martha and Sarah could earn in years. After he disappeared, there was another inquiry. His wife filed a report. His colleagues at the factory were surprised. He was a reliable man, and he'd been carrying company money. But the trail went cold in New Orleans. The local police sent back their standard reply. *subject has departed. No leads. Possible foul play related to a personal matter. Recommend suspending the case. The case was suspended. By 1975, the beat cop Tyrell Martin had figured some things out. He was 38, a short man with dark circles under his eyes, not from lack of sleep, but from thinking too much. He'd been walking the quarter beat for 5 years. He knew every crack in the sidewalk, and he had noticed a pattern. Out-of-towners who went into the cellar at the Miller sisters' place sometimes never came out. He started a list, carefully, not in his official notebook, but in a small memo book he kept at home, hidden under the mattress. 5 names, then 6. Missing persons, all men on business, all of them alone. Tyrell Martin went to his superior, Captain Costello. Eldar Costello was 45, a slow-moving, heavy-set man. He listened to Martin, took the memo book, and looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "You know whose family that is, Tyrell?" Martin knew. The Miller sisters, Councilman Sterling's nieces. "That's right," Costello said. "Put the book away. You stick to your beat. Missing persons is a job for the detectives, not for you." Martin put the book away, but he didn't throw it out. He hid it deeper under the mattress. Another 2 years passed. In that time, 8 more men passed through the supper club. 8 businessmen, sailors, salesmen, 8 pitchers of dark, sweet wine, 8 instances of quiet movement in the courtyard at night. 8 times, the well beneath the courtyard accepted what it was given. By 1977, Sarah no longer worried. Neither did Martha. They worked in perfect sync, like master craftswomen. Sarah knew who to choose. Lonely men, with no local connections, with cash in their pockets. Strangers nobody here was waiting for. People whose disappearance could be explained away 100 different ways. The supper club continued its quiet work. The warm light, the gumbo, the wine, and then Stephen Thompson, the journalist from the National magazine, walked in. 32 years old, with light brown hair and glasses. He had come from New York to write a feature story on the Louisiana oil boom. New offshore rigs, record production, American pride. His editor had given him a 2-week assignment. Thompson was a different kind of man. Not an engineer, not a sailor, He was a journalist, trained to notice details. He didn't drink much. He took notes. He had a reporter's notebook where he recorded everything: names, addresses, observations. When a friendly oil worker brought him to the supper club and said, "They serve good food here," Thompson looked around, took out his notebook, and wrote down the address. He went downstairs and sat. Sarah brought him wine. Thompson drank half a glass and set it down. "There's something unusual in this wine," he said thoughtfully. "Some kind of herb, an interesting flavor." Sarah smiled. "My father's recipe. Wild herbs from the bayou. It's a secret." Thompson wrote in his notebook, *, supper club, wine W, herbs, distinct taste, *. He drank a little more, talking with Sarah. He told her about New York. Sarah listened, but something wasn't right. Thompson had drunk less than the usual dose, or maybe his constitution was stronger, or the herbs in that particular pitcher were weaker. He felt a heaviness, but he didn't lose consciousness. He stood up, said he needed some air, and walked up the steps into the courtyard. Sarah didn't have time to call Martha. Thompson made it to the street, swaying slightly. He reached the corner, where he ran into a dock worker and asked for help getting back to his hotel. The next day, he called his editor in New York. He said he felt sick, that he'd had some strange wine and thought he might have been poisoned. His editor told him to get some rest. A day later, Thompson went back to the supper club. He didn't know what he was looking for. Something had just hooked him, a professional instinct, the strange wine. The two men at the next table who had left so quickly, and the look in Sarah's eyes as he'd gotten up to leave, not scared, no, but calculating. He went down the steps again. Sarah greeted him smoothly, without a hint of concern. She brought him food. She poured him wine, a different wine, lighter, from a different pitcher. Thompson noticed. He wrote in his notebook, *, second visit, different wine, *. He returned to New York a week later. He wrote his story on the oil boom and submitted it, but he also left a separate sheet of paper on his editor's desk, a page of notes, *, New Orleans, French Quarter, supper club, sisters, wine, missing, *. His editor found that sheet of paper later, because Stephen Thompson returned to New Orleans 3 months after that, on his own time, not on assignment, and this time, he didn't call New York. They realized he was missing after 2 weeks. The magazine sent an official inquiry to the New Orleans Police Department. They replied, * journalist was here, filed his report, and left. Last seen in the French Quarter, *. The editor in New York, a cautious, old-school man who understood how the world worked, didn't raise an immediate public alarm, but he sent a quiet, formal request to the Department of Justice. It was December of 1977. Thompson would be the 19th and final victim. Because the national magazine did not forget its missing reporter. Because behind the New York journalist stood a New York publication, and behind the publication were organizations that knew how to ask questions in a way that a provincial police captain could not ignore. The request slowly made its way through the system. Councilman Richard Sterling smothered it at every level he could reach, but he didn't have friends in every office. And not even the most corrupt city machine could completely silence the disappearance of a staff writer for a major national news outlet. More and more serious inquiries began to arrive in New Orleans. Captain Costello would receive them on his desk and stare at them with poorly concealed fear. And then, in October of 1978, the ground shook, and none of it mattered anymore. Not what Sterling was hiding, not what Costello was covering up, not what Mrs. Dubois was silent about. Because the well was open, and the bones were speaking for themselves. Matthew Miller had died slowly. Stomach cancer is a quiet, merciless disease. He grew thinner with each passing month, and in his final year, he could barely leave his bed. His daughters took turns caring for him. Martha at night, Sarah during the day. There was no money for proper medical care. They paid for the few medicines they could afford, things that barely helped. Aspirin and an herbal tincture that Martha brewed for an hour every day on the stove. When he died, on a sweltering August afternoon in 1965, all he left them was the house with its rotting front step, the 2 small rows of grapevines out back, the ceramic crocks of wine, and the recipe in Martha's head. He had never written it down. He just told her every year how to do it right, which leaves to add, how long to age it, at what temperature to store it. "You can't rush good wine," Sarah would later quote him as saying during her interrogation. "It comes when it's ready." That was 1965. The first murder was still 6 years away. After their father's death, the sisters were truly alone. Their uncle, Richard Sterling, rarely came by. Once every few months, he'd pull up in his black Lincoln, come inside, leave a little money on the table, and say, "You girls hang in there." Then he'd be gone. He had his own family, his own life, a career to build. The sisters lived on what they could scrape together. Martha did sewing for the neighbors, hemming dresses, mending shirts. Sarah cleaned tables at a cafe on Bourbon Street, $3 a day, 6 days a week. It was barely enough to pay the bills and buy food. They never complained, never asked for help. They just lived, day by day. Then, in 1968, Sarah suggested they open the supper club. "We know how to cook," she told Martha. "The wine is good. We have the space. The cellar is empty. We can ask Uncle Richard for the permits." Getting a permit for a private eatery was difficult, but for all his distance, Richard Sterling made it happen. He made a call to a friend at City Hall, and the paperwork was approved. Maybe he thought it would help his nieces make a life for themselves. Maybe he was just easing his conscience. The supper club opened in September of 1968. For the first 2 years, they ran it honestly. Gumbo, étouffée, homemade wine. The prices were modest, the place was quiet, and the clientele was steady. A few local men who came in the evenings to play cards and have a drink. A few out-of-town workers from the shipyards who didn't want to eat alone in a hotel diner. The supper club brought in a little money, but it was stable, about $80 a month. It was better than sewing and cleaning tables. But in 1970, something changed. More and more businessmen from up north started coming in, men with cash, with per diem allowances they hadn't had time to spend. Some of them came with thick wallets, purchasing agents, engineers, men carrying cash for off-the-books deals. Sarah saw it. She looked at their wallets. She looked at the pictures of her father's wine, and she thought. Later, she went to Martha and told her she had an idea. Martha listened in silence, then said, "No." Sarah didn't argue. She just waited. The winter of 1970 to 71 was hard. The furnace in the cellar broke. The repairs cost $20 they didn't have. The front step of the house rotted through. Martha cut her hand badly and couldn't sew for weeks, losing work. By the spring of 1971, they owed a neighbor $120. In April, Sarah talked to Martha again. This time, Martha said nothing, and silence, too, is an answer. Jimson weed, asterisk, datura, stramonium asterisk. It grows wild all over the South. A tall stalk with large, white, trumpet-shaped flowers. People have known about it for centuries. Farmers keep their livestock away from it. Children are warned. Don't touch. It's poison. In small doses, it causes a deep, hallucinatory sleep. In large doses, it causes death. Not a painful death, a quick one. The heart simply stops. Matthew Miller had known about Jimson weed. He knew that the old-timers, the ones who made country wine, would sometimes add a tiny bit of its essence to a batch for a special flavor and a heavy kick. It was an old, forgotten trick. He had told his daughters about it as a curiosity, something people used to do but shouldn't anymore. Sarah remembered. She gathered the Jimson weed herself in the wilder parts of City Park, far from any houses. She dried it in a dark closet. She made an infusion in a small clay pot, which she kept hidden in a nook under the stairs. She would add it to a specific pitcher just before serving it to a specific guest, only the one she had chosen. Everyone else drank the normal wine. It was precise work. She had to guess the dosage based on a man's size, on how much he'd already had to drink, on his general condition. Too little, and he would just fall asleep and wake up in the morning with no memory. Too much, and he would die right there at the table. A completely different situation. Sarah made mistakes a few times at the very beginning. The first 2 experiments, back in 1970, before Gene Walker, ended with the guests simply sleeping it off and leaving in the morning, confused. That should have been a sign to stop. Sarah took it as a sign to adjust the dosage. Then Gene Walker came, and the dose was just right. The investigation would later determine that for 3 or 4 of the victims, death came from the poison alone, without any physical violence. Their hearts simply stopped. The others were killed by Martha, quickly, while they were unconscious. The medical examiner confirmed it. Martha was professional and fast. There were no signs of a struggle. This is not an excuse. It is simply a fact. Alias Vance had expected resistance, but he didn't immediately recognize its form. It wasn't direct interference, not a call from on high ordering him to stop. It was a slow, soft, bureaucratic molasses. Documents that had to be requested a second time because the first request was lost. Witnesses who had suddenly left town on family emergencies. A medical examiner who took 3 days to produce a preliminary report. Vance wrote it all down in his notebook, neatly, with dates. Every 3 days, he called his supervisor in Washington and read the list of delays. Washington applied pressure from the other end through the state attorney general's office. By mid-November 1978, the resistance began to melt. Councilman Sterling was losing ground, and fast. Too many people knew about the case now. Too many documents had been sent to D.C. When it became clear he couldn't stop the investigation, he stopped trying. He just stepped back, silently, the way a man who has lost the game but refuses to admit it aloud retreats. Vance noted the moment in his book. Asterisk. Resistance has ceased. Can move faster now. Asterisk. He moved faster. One more detail Vance established during the investigation. The sisters never chose local victims. Not a single man from New Orleans, not one from Louisiana, only out-of-towners. Men from other states, with no local roots, no local family, no local friends who might make a real fuss. This was not a coincidence. It was a deliberate strategy, and it proved that the sisters were thinking, planning, assessing the risks. During her interrogation, Sarah confirmed it directly. We didn't touch the locals. That was the rule. Why? Vance asked. A local man. People look for him differently. An outsider just gets lost. Was that your idea? The detective asked. It was, Sarah said. Did Martha know about this rule? Yes. We both kept it. Vance wrote it down and made a note in the margin. Asterisk. Conscious victim selection. Aggravating factor. Asterisk. In the hiding place behind the furnace, they found more than just the victim's belongings. There was a notebook, a common spiral-bound notebook with a green cover. It was filled with entries in Sarah's handwriting, a fact later confirmed by a handwriting expert. There were no names in the notebook, only dates and sums of money. October 71, 42, April 72, 116, asterisk, and so on. 18 entries in total. The last one was dated September 1977 for $208. It was a ledger of murder, precise, methodical, like an accounting book from a general store. When Vance showed the notebook to Sarah during her interrogation, she looked at it for a long time. Then she said, I wanted to know how much we'd earned over all that time. And how much was it? Vance asked. Sarah did the math in her head. About $9,500. maybe a little more. $9,500 for 17 lives. Less than $500 a person. Less than a skilled engineer made in 4 months. Vance put the notebook back in an evidence bag and said nothing. Sarah looked at him. "You want to understand how we could do it," she said. "I don't understand it myself, not anymore. But back then, I did. It seemed simple. We needed money. They had it. No one would miss them. It was simple now. Now it's not simple." It was the only moment in all the long hours of questioning when Sarah seemed to be speaking not for the official record, but from some place deeper. Martha never saw the notebook. Vance deliberately kept it from her. He wanted to see if she knew about the bookkeeping. When asked about it, Martha answered shortly. "Sarah handled the money. I didn't count it." "You weren't interested in the amount?" "No." "Then what were you interested in?" Martha lifted her gaze and looked directly at the detective. "That Sarah was okay," she said. "Nothing else." It was, perhaps, the strangest answer of the entire investigation, and the most human, because behind all of it, the 17 murders, the well of bones, the ledger of death, it wasn't just greed. It was a sister who wanted money, and another sister who, for her sake, did things that she would later say she was sorry for. "I'm sorry," she'd said, "but it doesn't change anything." 2 women who had grown up with only each other, who were used to protecting each other, who had found a monstrous way to do just that. It is not an excuse, but it is the truth. October 15th, 1978, New Orleans Police Department Homicide Division. Captain Costello sat at his desk, staring at the preliminary crime scene report. The well. 21 skeletons. The medical examiner would confirm that number later. For now, the report just said many. All male, all adults. Signs of violent death on most. Near the well, remnants of clothing. A leather belt, an aluminum spoon with the initials PS scratched into the handle. Metal buttons from a sailor's pea coat. Costello lit his 3rd cigarette in a row and thought about how his life, as he knew it, was ending right now, because the house next to the well was the Miller house. The well was in their courtyard, and the entire French Quarter knew that courtyard belonged to them. Costello called Councilman Richard Sterling at his office. "Richard," he said, "we have a situation." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I heard." Sterling finally answered, "Wait for my call." But there was no time to wait. The fire department was already there. Onlookers were already gathering. One of the cleanup crew had already run to a nearby bar and told his story. By evening, the entire French Quarter knew that a well of bones had been found in the old courtyard behind the Miller sisters' place. By morning, the rumors had reached the local news desks, and a day later, they reached Washington. The teletype went out, short and to the point. Asterisk mass grave. Suspected homicide. Location: New Orleans, French Quarter. Victim count pending. Asterisk. In Washington, they read it, they considered it, and they made a decision common in federal practice. Send one of our own. It was what they did when local authorities either couldn't handle a case or, worse, didn't want to. They chose Vance. Elias Vance, Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation, 34 years old. From a small town in Pennsylvania, the son of a high school history teacher. Law school, then Quantico, then the Violent Crimes Unit. In his 7 years with the Bureau, he'd worked cases in the Midwest, in the Pacific Northwest, on the East Coast. He was calm, meticulous, with a habit of writing everything down in a small pocket-sized notebook and never interrupting the person he was talking to. This was his first time in the South. He flew in on October 17th. The airport was humid. The air, a mix of jet fuel and the smell of the swamp. Captain Costello met him. He was silent, tense, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "Good flight?" Costello asked as they drove. "Fine," Vance replied. "Take me to the scene." It was the only conversation they had for the entire ride. In the French Quarter, Vance spent 3 hours examining the well. He walked around it, crouched down, studied the stonework, the heavy slate cover, the way the slabs had been placed. He asked the medical examiner quiet questions, then fell silent again, just looking. Then he asked Costello, "Whose courtyard?" The Millers Costello said, adding, as if it were an afterthought, "Respected family. Their uncle is Richard Sterling, the councilman." Vance wrote the name down in his notebook without comment. The sisters, where are they now? At home. Leave them. For now, I want the paperwork first. That same evening, Vance locked himself in the temporary office they'd given him and started to work. Missing persons reports from the French Quarter and surrounding areas for the last 8 years. Hotel guest ledgers. Inquiries sent to other cities about cold cases. By midnight, he had 11 files on his desk. 11 men who had disappeared between 1,971 and 1,977. All of them male, all from out of town, all last seen in the vicinity of the French Quarter. The medical examiner would later confirm 21 bodies in the well. Some would never be identified. But those who were, identified by dental records and personal effects, were a perfect match for the names on his list. 21 men over 7 years. That was 3 a year. 1 every 4 months. Vance closed the files, stood up, and walked to the window. Outside was a dark street and the distant lights of ships on the Mississippi. He understood 2 things immediately. First, these were serial murders, planned, systematic, and ongoing for years. Second, powerful people were going to try to stop him from solving this case. The next morning, Vance requested the file on the missing journalist Stephen Thompson. He also asked for Thompson's personal effects to be sent down from New York. His reporter's notebook was among them. On a torn-out sheet covered in notes, Vance read the words, * Supper Club, wine, W, herbs, distinct taste, *, and a little lower, * sisters, wine, missing, * Thompson had figured it out. He just hadn't lived to tell anyone. Vance closed the notebook, stood up, and went to find Captain Costello. "I need a list of everyone who worked at that supper club," he said. "Everyone who was a regular. And I need to talk to your beat cop, the one who walks the quarter, Martin." Costello's face went pale. "Why, Martin?" "Because he's been here a long time," Vance said. "And I think he knows something." Tyrell Martin came to see Vance the next day. He sat down, looked at the table for a long time, then stood up, took off his uniform jacket, and from behind the lining, he pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a list, written in tiny pencil script, with dates and notes. "I started this in 1974, he said quietly. "Kept it for 4 years. I went to Costello. He told me to drop it." Vance took the list and read it in silence. 8 names, businessmen, sailors, a sales rep, all last seen near the supper club. Martin had recorded all of them. Not in his official log, he'd never have been allowed, but here, on a personal list that had lived behind the lining of his jacket for 4 years. "Why didn't you go over his head?" Vance asked. Martin looked up at him. "You know who Councilman Sterling is?" Vance knew. "It's my job now," he said, "not yours. But I need you as a witness, and as my guide to this neighborhood." Martin nodded. He put his jacket back on. For the first time in their conversation, he exhaled. For the next 3 days, Vance worked quietly. No high-profile arrests, no raids. He just walked the quarter with Officer Martin, talking to people. Not interrogations. Conversations. Over coffee, in courtyards, on park benches. Antoine Rousseau, the antique dealer, at first said, "Didn't see a thing, didn't hear a thing." But after Vance sat in his dusty shop for 2 hours, patiently sipping chicory coffee, Rousseau suddenly said, "I heard things. At night, a few times over the years. A dull thud, like something heavy being dropped." "When was the last time?" "Last fall." September, maybe. How many times? Total? Rousseau thought, counting on his fingers, staring at the ceiling. 10. Maybe more. Vance wrote it down. Mrs. Dubois let him in her house only after he had sat on her front step for 40 minutes. Just sitting there on the cool stone, waiting. He didn't knock a second time. He just waited. Finally, she opened the door and peered at him. You're from Washington? Yes, ma'am. You here for long? Until it's finished. She was quiet for a moment, then opened the door wider. Come in. Inside, it was dark and smelled of old wood and dried herbs. Mrs. Dubois sat on a low stool and folded her hands in her lap. I saw things, she said. Many times. I saw, at night, Martha, in the courtyard, with something heavy. I told myself she was moving wine. I didn't want to think otherwise. You were afraid? Vance asked gently. Yes, she said. I was afraid. Everyone here was afraid of Richard Sterling. He could ruin a person with a single word. He could. You don't have to be afraid anymore, Vance said. Mrs. Dubois looked at him for a long time. Are you sure about that? Vance didn't answer. Because he wasn't. On the fourth day, he went to City Hall. Councilman Richard Sterling received him in an office with high ceilings and a portrait of the mayor on the wall. He stood to greet Vance, shook his hand with a politician's firm grip, and offered him a drink. I hear you're working that tragic case in the quarter, he said with an easy smile. A terrible business, but I imagine it's an old burial site. The Vieux Carré is an old place. The ground there remembers many wars. Forensics has established, Vance said evenly, that the burials are no more than 10 years old. Some are less than 2. Sterling's smile didn't waver. Well, then, we will, of course, assist the investigation in any way we can. I'll need a warrant to search your niece's home. A brief pause. That's a serious step, Agent Vance. You understand these women are respected members of the community. A baseless accusation could do irreparable harm to their reputation. This will need to be properly authorized. I understand, Vance said. I'll wait, but not for long. He left, got into his car, and wrote down the date and time of the conversation in his notebook. Then he called Washington, reported the situation, and requested a federal warrant. Not through Costello, not through the local DA's office. Directly. Washington granted the warrant 2 days later, overriding local authority. Richard Sterling found out on the morning of October 24th, 1978. By then, it was too late. Vance secured a crucial piece of evidence even before the raid. In the pocket of one of the victims, Arthur Lewis, identified by a distinctive dental bridge, they found a folded check, a company check from Chicago, made out to A.M. Lewis for the amount of $800, dated September 1975. The check was damp and slightly warped, but still legible. This check could not have ended up in the well by accident. It had been on the victim, which meant the victim had been in the well, which meant the murder had happened right here, in this courtyard. It was a direct link to the Miller sisters. Vance held the check in his hand for a few minutes, then sealed it in an evidence envelope and had it sent to the FBI lab in Washington for safekeeping. He understood that if something went wrong here, in New Orleans, the evidence in Washington would remain. He was a man who thought several moves ahead. In those few days, Martha and Sarah lived their normal lives. The supper club was closed. After the discovery in the well, the sisters had put up a sign that read, "Closed for repairs." Sarah still went to the market. Martha stayed home. They didn't speak about it. Not because they were hiding from each other. There were simply no words left. Sarah would later tell the detective, "I knew they were coming. I felt it from the morning they found the well, but I didn't run. There was nowhere to go. We'd lived our whole lives here." Martha would say nothing. She would just nod once, slowly, when asked if she was guilty. October 25th, 1978. 6 o'clock in the morning. The narrow street in the quarter was still dark when two unmarked police sedans pulled up to the Miller house. No sirens, no flashing lights, just Vance, two other agents from his office, a medical examiner, and two official witnesses, a pair of bakers from the next street over. Captain Costello was not present. Vance had cut him out of the loop 2 days earlier, quietly, without explanation. He just stopped sharing information. He knocked on the door. Sarah opened it. She was already dressed, as if she'd been waiting. A simple dark dress, a scarf around her neck. She looked at Vance calmly. "Agent Vance," she said, "I was expecting you. Is Martha home?" "Yes. She's asleep. Please wake her." The sisters came out into the main room and sat together on a small sofa. Martha sat straight, her powerful hands resting on her knees. Sarah was a little pale, but composed. Vance read them the search warrant. He explained it briefly, slowly. Sarah translated for her sister. Martha listened, her eyes fixed on a far wall. The search took 4 hours. The agents were methodical. The kitchen, the pantry, the cellar, the courtyard. In the pantry, they found 12 ceramic crocks of wine. Vance had one opened immediately. Dark, thick wine, with a strong herbal scent. The examiner sniffed it and said, "It'll have to go to the lab, but I'm willing to bet there's more than just grapes in here." The lab would later confirm the presence of a potent infusion of Jimson weed. Combined with alcohol, it produced a rapid and deep state of unconsciousness. A small dose induced sleep, a large dose, a coma, a very large dose, a quiet death, with no signs of violence. A smart poison, an old one, known in the rural South for centuries. In the cellar, they found a section of loose bricks behind the old furnace. The mortar was a different color, newer. The agents dismantled the wall in half an hour. Behind it was a small, hidden cavity. Inside, they found the following: 15 men's belts, 7 wristwatches, one of them engraved, asterisk, to Arthur, from the team at Midwest Canned Goods, 1,970, asterisk, 2 U.S. passports, both with Chicago addresses, a stack of cash of various denominations, tied with twine. Vance would later count it, $9,400, and several company ID cards, some of them yellowed with age, with dates from 1971 and 72. The agent, who cleared out the hiding place, walked back out into the courtyard, lit a cigarette, and stood in silence for several minutes. Vance went in, surveyed the contents, and recorded them in his notebook. Calmly, methodically, item by item. Then he went back to the sisters. "Martha Miller, Sarah Miller," he said, "you are under arrest on suspicion of murder." Sarah closed her eyes, then opened them. She spoke in a steady voice. "I'll tell you everything. I'll tell you all of it myself." Martha said nothing. She just stood and held out her hands for the cuffs. The neighbors watched from their windows. Mrs. Dubois stood in the doorway of her home, wrapped in a shawl. She watched as the sisters were led to the car. Her face was old and tired. Antoine Rousseau opened his antique shop late that day. He later told a neighbor, "I couldn't watch it. I heard those noises for years. I told myself it was just cats." The first interrogation of Sarah Miller lasted 6 hours. She spoke calmly, without tears or hysterics. She just told the story, like someone recounting a long familiar tale. She started in 1971, with Gene Walker. "It was Martha's idea," she began, then faltered. "No, that's not true. It was my idea. Martha didn't want to, not at first. I convinced her." She told them about the wine, about their father's recipe, which they had altered by adding the Jimson weed. A little at first, then more, finding the right dose. She told them about the well, how they'd found it by accident while fixing the courtyard stones, how they'd realized it was the perfect place. "Did you understand that you were murdering people?" Vance asked. "Yes," Sarah said. "And you just didn't stop?" "No." "Why?" A long pause. "Money," she said. "It was just money. There's no other reason. It was the unadorned truth. In her first interrogation, Martha just sat in silence. She wouldn't answer any questions. Finally, the detective asked her directly, "Did you kill people in that house?" Martha raised her head and looked at him for several seconds. "Yes," she said, "I did." "How many?" "I don't remember exactly." "A lot." "Are you sorry?" A long silence. "Sorry," she said at last, quietly, almost a whisper. "Sorry, but it doesn't change anything." It was the only moment when a flicker of something human broke through. Vance wrote it down in his notebook. Verbatim. Richard Sterling was brought in for questioning on the third day. He came with a lawyer and denied everything. He claimed he knew nothing, that he rarely saw his nieces, that his attempts to quash inquiries were merely to protect his family's reputation from baseless rumors. He had no knowledge of any crimes. Vance showed him a list of missing persons cases that had been closed after a phone call from his office at City Hall. 5 cases, 5 missing men, whose investigations had been halted each and every time after a call from the office of Councilman Richard Sterling. Sterling looked at the list for a long time. Then he said, "I need to speak with my lawyer." His lawyer was expensive and experienced, but the evidence was so overwhelming that there was little even he could do. The investigation lasted 8 months. For 8 months, Vance built a case that could not be broken because he knew they would try. Medical experts identified 17 of the 21 dead. 4 remain nameless. Among the identified, Gene Walker from Detroit, Paulie Simmons from Galveston, Arthur Lewis from Chicago, Stephen Thompson from New York, and 13 other men whose families finally received an answer to the question that had haunted them for years. The lab confirmed the presence of Jimson weed in the wine. Forensics confirmed the items from the hiding place belonged to the deceased. Sarah's testimony was detailed, consistent, and matched the evidence perfectly. The case was ironclad. Richard Sterling was indicted for obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact to multiple homicides. He was forced to resign from the city council in November of 1978. The trial began in June of 1979. It was closed to the public. The prosecutor spoke calmly, without theatrics. He read the indictment, and then he listed the names of the dead. All 17. First name, middle initial, last name, year of birth, hometown. In the courtroom were the families of the victims, the wife of Arthur Lewis, the mother of Paulie Simmons, who had come all the way from Galveston, an old woman dressed in black, colleagues of Stephen Thompson from the magazine. As the names were read, the courtroom was utterly silent. Sarah remained composed throughout the trial. She did not deny her guilt. When she was given the chance to make a final statement, she stood and said, "I ask for the forgiveness of the families, not because it will help them, but because I have no other words to offer." The room remained silent. Martha stood for her final statement, waited a moment, then said, "I have nothing to say." That was all. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict, guilty on all counts. The sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole for both sisters. Richard Sterling received a sentence of 15 years. He was sent to a federal prison and was never seen in New Orleans again. Captain Costello was fired from the police force and received a suspended sentence for dereliction of duty. Elias Vance flew back to Washington a week after the verdict was read. He submitted the case file to the archives and received an official commendation. The case was never spoken of publicly again. The transfer to the federal penitentiary was scheduled for October of 1979, but the sentence was not carried out as planned. A week before the transfer, Sarah Miller died in her jail cell, sewn into the hem of the dress she was arrested in. Guards found a tiny, cloth-wrapped vial of a dark oil. The lab analysis showed it was a concentrated, lethal extract of Jimson weed. She had carried it with her through the entire investigation, through the entire trial. Why had she waited 7 months, almost until the very end? No one knows. Perhaps she had held out some hope. Perhaps she wanted to die on her own terms. Or perhaps she had simply become accustomed to waiting for the right moment. She died quietly in her cell during the night. A guard found her in the morning. The expression on her face was calm. Martha was transferred in November of 1979 to a maximum security facility in West Virginia. She served 14 years there before dying of heart failure in 1993, quietly. The Miller sisters' case was sealed. The fact of the trial and the verdict exist in public records, but the investigative files were moved to a classified archive. Not a single line about it appeared in the newspapers. The names Martha and Sarah Miller were scrubbed from public view, as neatly and quietly as they had kept their well hidden under the flagstones. Why? There is no official explanation. One can only guess. 17 victims is not a small matter. It's a story of a systemic failure of law enforcement. A story of a powerful politician protecting murderers. It was a story the city of New Orleans did not want to tell about itself. It was easier to close the file, seal it, and forget. And the French Quarter was silent too. Not because it was ordered to be, but because the old city knows how to keep its secrets. It's in its nature, in the narrow streets and the high courtyard walls. Mrs. Dubois never told another soul what she told the man from Washington. Antoine Rousseau went on selling his antiques for another 20 years. He never spoke of his neighbors with the dark cellar. The supper club was closed, the cellar bricked up, the well filled with gravel and sealed with concrete. The Miller house was seized by the city. It stood empty for years, then was eventually converted into apartments. People live there now, ordinary people who know nothing of Martha and Sarah. They hang their laundry on the same lines, and their cats sleep on the same windowsills. Life goes on, as it always does, right on top of what was buried. What pushes people to do such things? That is a question the investigation never answered. A psychiatric evaluation found both sisters to be legally sane. No mental disorders, no pathologies. Just two people who decided, one day, that a stranger's life was worth less than the money in his pocket. Sarah was the charmer, Martha was the muscle. Both knew what they were doing. Both did it again and again. There is no convenient explanation, no childhood trauma that excuses it all, no outside pressure that removes the responsibility. There was only a choice they made 17 times over. That is what is truly frightening, not the poison in the wine or the well beneath the courtyard. The terrifying part is that this was not the work of monsters. It was the work of people. Martha, who cried that first night. Sarah, who asked for forgiveness in court. People capable of sorrow and apology, who still kept going. The supper club in the cellar no longer exists, but the French Quarter still stands. The same walls, the same narrow lanes, the same cats on the sills, the smell of sweet olive in the autumn, the smell of hot stone in the summer, if you ever find yourself there. And you walk down a set of old stone steps into the half-light, where a lamp is glowing and the air smells of gumbo and thyme, and a smiling woman pours you a dark, sweet wine from a ceramic pitcher. Remember Gene Walker from Detroit? He also thought he was just stopping in for dinner. This is a story about 17 men who walked down a set of stone steps and never came back. And it's a story about the fact that evil, most of the time, looks perfectly ordinary. It smiles with honey-colored eyes and offers you another glass.